Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece Chapter 1086 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. So I'm pretty certain most everybody knows this by now, but I feel like it's important to bring up anyway. One Piece will be on break for the next month because Oda is getting surgery. But it sounds far worse than it actually is. Oda has astigmatism, and he's getting some sort of laser eye corrective surgery. I personally have astigmatism. Apparently this is like a new development for Oda. He didn't need glasses like for his entire life until 2018. Well, I've needed glasses pretty much since I was 15 years old because of astigmatism, and it's not a big deal. If you're curious though, for the most surface level analysis here, it's about the shape of your eyeball. And this can actually change over time, which is why astigmatism gets progressively worse. The surgery also that he's intending on getting is really nothing to worry about. It could be something to worry about, not like death-wise, but just screwing up your eyes if you went a cheap route and you went to some sort of cheap doctor or cheap agency that isn't very good. But this is Eiichiro Oda, king of Japan. I'm sure that he's getting the best eye surgery that you could possibly imagine. The risk is obviously, I think doctors will tell you there's always risk there, but realistically, probably not. I actually also have experience with screwy eye surgery, not personally, but my father, who didn't have astigmatism, just normal near and farsightedness, something like that, he got cheap eye surgery and they really messed it up. So the result of that was needing 2 different prescriptions for each eye and making one worse. And yeah, I mean, it's not like life-threatening or totally ruining anything, it's just a real inconvenience. So yeah, the break will suck, but we've dealt with this recently, so I feel like we're prepped up. We went through our training arc, and I'll try to fill you guys with as much content as possible during the lull. And in the meantime, I think that this is nothing but good news. Oda gets some time to sort of relax, spend with his family, possibly plan things out, or just, it's just good sometimes to take a break. Taking a break should be normalized. But I just want to share my conspiracy theory while we're here. It could be wrong, and frankly, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. Whatever will happen anyway. But what Oda choosing to have the surgery now is very optional, based on everything that we know and I know. So I don't think that Oda would choose to have this surgery if it weren't an ideal stopping point. Now, this being an ideal stopping point works, I think, 2 ways. And for me, it means that either Egghead is almost over, and Oda has everything he essentially needs to complete the arc, including probably many of the chapters. It might be weird to some people think Egghead might almost be over, but I could see it playing out very quickly. I think that post-time skip we're used to longer pacing, but Oda's fully capable of wrapping things up way faster than we're used to. Or on the other hand, there's so much more left of Egghead that now is the time to do the surgery since he wants it. As we saw with the last break that Oda took at the end of last year, part of it was about planning the next arc, and I like the thought that Oda is now making a more concerted effort to, in between events, to take a month off, to plot things in more depth. For me, this adds up somewhat as well, because if the surgery is exactly what we think that it is, it doesn't really require Oda to take an entire month off. So Oda could have other things sort of planned into this vacation. Not that Oda really ever takes a vacation. It's stated to be a goal of finishing One Piece as soon as possible. I think Oda and the editors and the entire team and everybody related to One Piece wants it to be more concise. So that's, with a surgery that happens and then it takes a couple days to recover, but he's taken an entire month off, there may be more to this than meets the eye. Haha! Either that, or they feel like with the events that we just got right now, transitioning back into Egghead is also a good time to stop, and Oda doesn't feel like he's going to finish it anytime soon and just wants to deal with this while he has a good excuse a good place to leave the fandom off on, which was definitely the case because everything leading up to this chapter and this chapter itself has been incredible. But anyway, we begin this chapter at the conclusion of the Reverie. Cobra has already died, but information of it is only beginning to spread. We see that Wapol and Vivi have escaped with Big Moose Morgans, while Sabo and Jewelry Bonnie have escaped on separate ships, Sabo with Lulusia Kingdom. Then we see the Gorosei talking about the events, and specifically talking about Sabo, mentioning that he has a checkered fate. This is something I don't think I've ever brought up before, and I actually Googled it because I thought checkered fate was a common expression, but if you actually Google checkered fate, the only things that actually come up are One Piece things. Like guys, I literally Googled checkered fate meaning and One Piece things came up. I was like hoping that there would be some agreed upon meaning there that we could discuss it from and apply it to One Piece, but seems like a One Piece specific term. Now I think the reason for my confusion is there's a similar expression in English, and please let me know if you're from other countries if you also have this expression and it just doesn't come up on my side of the internet or not. But in English we have checkered past, and what it colloquially means is that somebody has done bad things in the past. They've been in trouble. So you could apply this to checkered fate. Rather than past, it's like future. So you're fated to get into trouble, to do quote-unquote bad things. But again, if this is an English-only expression, I'm not sure how likely it is to have the same meaning with what Oda's using here. And so from this, the most common thing that was mentioned is a theory by Totally Not Mark, in which he discusses what we've discussed on the channel for a long time now, even before even thinking about checkered fate in the story, about the inversions of One Piece, which are definitely there. I think that these theories were initially sort of blanketed together as like through the looking glass, but I like checkered fate a lot more, especially since it's an actual term used in the story. Anyway, this term was first brought up by Sengoku, talking about the D's always having checkered fates, and this same sort of sentiment is brought up in this chapter, sort of reaffirming it. And I think that I agree with Totally Not Mark's interpretation that this has something to do with One Piece inversions. Repeating history, so to speak. This probably interrelates with the inherited will, and we could talk about this in great depth, like with Bink Sake, for instance, and all sorts of other things, but there's an importance to having a dream within the story. And the D's, they smile before they die because they know that even if they don't succeed in their own personal ambitions or goals or whatever, that eventually what they want will happen. And it's because their will is inherited. So death and failure aren't the end of the world. I also like this term of checkered fate because checkers is a game. And being a game, it's also talking about people like Luffy and how they live their lives. Think about, like ancient pirates as well with Davy back fights. It just seems like a very fitting term. And as most likely in like the grander scale of the story, we're continuing the conflict between the 20 kingdoms and the ancient kingdoms, or whatever occurred during the Void Century, that conflict is unresolved, then the end of the story is going to be likely an inversion of what occurred during the Void Century in some respects. So thinking about it as an unfinished game could be fitting. But I suppose the most direct takeaway is that Sabo may have some role to play in in-game events. That the Gorosei didn't really acknowledge him as a person of importance, but now that he is so often associated with the Family D and the events that have occurred here at the Reverie, they're starting to view him as a person that matters. So I think that your expectations for what Sabo will do in the story should rise, and this is kind of what the Gorosei intimate, where they were focused on Egghead, but then, because of Sabo, their attention has shifted. But I find that curious to be included in this chapter because it seems contradictory to what we got later, right? We know this occurred in the past. In the future, Gorosei is actually heading towards Egghead, so there's so much going on that what Oda is trying to do is justify why, for the first time in the story, the Gorosei are on the move. The Marines and the government are so stacked with things to do that the Gorosei can no longer sit back. Or another thought is that the reveal of Straw Hat Luffy in Egghead is really what tipped the scales and made the Gorosei and Emu government reevaluate how they're handling Egghead and whether to put it off. And I like this thought a lot as well, because I feel like whether it's for the Straw Hats or it's for who has just arrived in Egghead, Blackbeard, Vegapunk is an important checkers piece or a chess piece. And I think the government realizes this, that if Vegapunk aligns himself with any of their enemies, it's not good for them. It could potentially be catastrophic. And of one reason among many is the fact that in this chapter we see what Vegapunk is actually capable of. We pan from this Gorosei, they're interrupted, to Emu, who's finally decided to use Vegapunk's invention, the Mother Flame, to destroy Lolosia. There is so much to say here, I really don't know where to begin. First off, I think that we know that the Mother Flame is related to what Vegapunk was discussing with this like eternal power source earlier in Egghead. I believe that he called it the power of the sun, and it was what previously had been what powered these iron giant things. You know, what's interesting here is Vegapunk didn't appear as if they intimated they were very close to actually discovering what this was or recreating it, right? But, you know, at the same time, Vegapunk is known to be hypercritical, and massive successes are still considered failures in his eyes, because he is a perfectionist. But this continues to be on theme with Vegapunk, who is slowly but surely creating things that are a huge threat to our heroes and frankly to the world. And they don't seem to be 100% aware of the fact that they're doing this, which is curious as well. Like, for instance, the artificial devil fruit that Momonosuke, also considered to be a failure, very clearly not. The Pacifista are obviously going to be a big problem long term, the Seraphim as well, you know, and you can maybe like think that Vegapunk in both of these circumstances was still acting as the good guy. Like, first off, there's some relation between Vegapunk and the Revolutionary Army. Vegapunk might actually be a member, but he's got to play his role. He's got to make sure that he maintains his cover. So if the government is asking for him to invent things, for instance, devil fruits, then he's got to at least try. So he went through the process, did the science, created something that worked, and maybe it wasn't 100% that he's a perfectionist. The other half of this was, hey, let's just pretend like it's a failure so that the government doesn't utilize this, because this is way too powerful. If we start mass producing Momonosuke's artificial devil fruit, that is a problem for all of the world government's enemies, which includes me. I think this mentality held up until this chapter, with Vegapunk essentially recreating what I believe to be an ancient weapon, very similar to it. Assuming that Imu is telling the truth, I don't know why Imu would lie. Vegapunk, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? And even more alarming in all of this is that Vegapunk created it, but the Revolutionary Army, who he seems to be aligned with in some aspects, has no idea. Sabo has no idea what just occurred to Lucia. The Revolutionary Army, they're discussing it and they're totally mind blown. And this is Vegapunk's invention. Previously, I had developed a headcanon that this was literally an ancient weapon, built hundreds of years in the past that the Gorosei and Imu have just been maintaining very low-key, secretly. It's just been in their back pocket. But no, Vegapunk created it. And it had to have been done recently. I've been super sketched out with Vegapunk. If you guys have been following my thoughts on the Egghead arc, especially towards the beginning, you know, there's something that strikes me as off about Vegapunk. You could say, well, some of his personalities perhaps are evil. We've gone through that plot arc and betrayal and such, but there's no way that one Vegapunk created the Mother Flame without all of the others involved or knowing about it at all. I cannot believe that to be true. So Vegapunk created something that literally has the potential to wipe islands off the map. And told who? Told nobody. Are you guys as sketched out as I am? Like I said, this could all turn out to be sort of a joke. Oda doesn't intend for anything really interesting with Vegapunk's character, and more so, he's just such a perfectionist that, you know, he's so smart, but at the same time so dumb, essentially. So he created a thing, it wasn't exactly right, he threw it in the bin, and the world government immediately knew, like, oh, this isn't bin-worthy, but just didn't tell him. So picked it up, and then is now utilizing it, and Vegapunk is gonna come back, like, shocked Pikachu face later, like, whoa, whoops, you know, and that could be the truth. At the same time, I have a feeling that Vegapunk is chaotic neutral. He's primarily motivated in two ways. First, as a scientist, he wants to create new things, and second, he cares about himself, his own self-preservation. So in the pursuit of science, he's doing things that he knows is illegal, and therefore will eventually make the world's government his enemy. Then, out of a sense of self-preservation, aligns himself with their enemies in case he ever needs cover or somebody to protect him. And while this might seem like a subtle difference, it could actually play a role in the story at some point in time if Vegapunk is really not concerned with or doesn't have a great grasp of right and wrong. But yeah, the main reason that I bring this up is Blackbeard has arrived to Egghead, and this is just what Blackbeard does in a story, is he shows up where people least expect him with a plan that nobody anticipates, in order to capitalize on current events. That's just what Blackbeard always does. So I think that if you break it down, what can Blackbeard gain from the Egghead conflict? Certainly, Blackbeard doesn't fight people just for the sake of it, right? Certainly has no interest in protecting Vegapunk or protecting the Strats just from good-naturedness. So, the only thing that sticks out as something that Blackbeard could acquire that could be very crucial to the endgame is one of the Vegapunks, at least. Although it's technically possible that Blackbeard has some plan regarding the Gorosei, I personally don't know how Blackbeard would have anticipated the Gorosei heading to Egghead. But, Blackbeard is a smart character at times, so maybe. But for sure, there is a reason why the world government and Emu 800 years ago intentionally regressed the world. Things like the Iron Giant, right? That is void century. It's illegal. And there has to be some justification for that. And as far as I'm aware, it should be related to how dangerous these creations possibly were. They talk often about how the ancient weapons are capable of destroying the world, and it is a great fear. This is something almost explicitly discussed in the story from Frankie's flashback in Water 7. Frankie invented things that he never intended to hurt anyone. They were just really cool, and he enjoyed the process of making them, but they fell into the wrong hands, and ultimately were used against him and were capable of a lot of evil. But yeah, long story short, there was a reason which made the government weary of technology in the past, and I think as we get into the future of the story, these fears need to be justified by falling into, from the world government's perspective, the wrong hands. This includes both the Straw Hats and Blackbeard, who could both acquire one Vegapunk. However, the Strats would never use a weapon like a weapon, so if you really want a taste of the consequences, it needs to go to somebody like Blackbeard. So this sets up both the world government and a character like Blackbeard possessing weapons capable of destroying the world, likely pitted against one another. Truly, the world could be destroyed, and it will feel like that. And I think that this aligns with a lot of the things that we've gotten in the story, especially post-timeskip. But concepts of this are related to the pre-timeskip as well. You can talk about like Don Krieg and all the pirates generally have been able to acquire more technology than most of the countries of the world, is basically what I'm saying. And through Doflamingo and Kaido, you can see the accumulation of scientific weaponry is a big deal. I think it would be very fitting for Blackbeard to begin to tap into this and be able to utilize it for himself, because up till this point in time, aside from Devil Fruits, which were probably technology related but not quite the same thing, aside from Devil Fruits, right, Blackbeard hasn't. So yeah, it pretty much is a really cool idea in my head that the Stella Vegapunk survives, and rather than aligning themselves with the Straw Hats or the Revolutionary Army, potentially good guys, right, instead joins Blackbeard, because the secret is that he's really chaotic neutral. And the other way that I think this works is, so far, Blackbeard has not shown any interest in lost history, the Void Century, ancient weapons, or poneglyphs, really. Pretty much at all. I suppose capturing Pudding could be one thing, but Blackbeard hasn't really talked about any of this. Vegapunk has a lot of knowledge in this regard, can give it to Blackbeard and set him up for the end of the story. But if it's not about Vegapunk specifically here for Blackbeard, it could also be about Punk Records. Since Punk Records is such a ill-defined thing at this point, how people might utilize it is not clear. I don't lean towards this right now, but literally Oda could throw in anything at any time and suddenly it makes a ton of sense what Blackbeard might want with that. But yeah, while we're here, another really interesting thing to me is how the government needed Vegapunk in order to recreate something that is like an ancient weapon. And pretty much every advancement that the government has had is all centered around Vegapunk. So, and this is interesting to me because the world government technically won during the Void Century, and yes, they outlawed all these various forms of technology and history and whatnot, but I always presumed that it was possible that Emu, who is likely from the Void Century, could have retained this knowledge secretly, such that only he and perhaps the Gorosei had access to it, so that they could pull it out if they needed to eventually. But it's looking less and less like that's the case. I'm really not sure how to discuss this, but I think something related to this might be important. But anyway, from this point, we then get the Gorosei's perspective on Emu's demand, and they bring up some questions like there's a lot of people on Lolosia, and etc., right? But all the leaders, the Gorosei, justify what is taking place in various ways, which is the kind of social and political commentary that One Piece delivers from time to time that I find to be very enjoyable. Great evil is reasonably justified every day. But yeah, what the blonde Gorosei brings up here of, with this weapon, we could instantly snuff out any protracted conflict. These are the kinds of things that I like thinking about. Not because I enjoy the idea of pretty much genocide, right? But, you know, you can make arguments for some pretty inhumane things. And it just makes for great villains. Like, just think about this for a moment. The weapon that the Gorosei and Imu used against Lolsia equates to a real-life atomic bomb, and in real life, atomic bombs were actually used. And their use was justified. But can it really? This story, I'm just telling you guys, this story rings so much stronger, more impactful, because Oda is from Japan. So, these events happening in the story related to Japan, maybe, you know, it's something that Oda is thoughtful about. Maybe he has something to say. Look, man, there's a plethora of stories which discuss in depth how protracted conflict is suffering. Ultimately, an endless fight could cost more life than something that is decisive. But I think integral to the conversation is what is right and wrong. You know, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And in most cases, you know, there's no clear-cut answer. This is especially true the more that you know. It's easy to paint villains, and a lot of stories do, of just being murderous and totally evil, but it's really not how it works realistically. Like, just for some political commentary, I know that none of you guys want, but I believe this, and I don't really care if you disagree. I think that humans, people, we're killing our planet. I think we are consuming more resources and not replenishing them, and over the long term, we will destroy this world. I have no idea when this will occur, but I'm pretty certain that it will. So knowing that I believe this wholeheartedly, you could actually consider me to be part of the problem, because I'm not really actively doing anything to prevent this, spread knowledge or awareness, combat it in any way. I just basically think that my sphere of influence is very limited, and what will happen anyway, and I'm just existing. It's like that meme of everything is on fire around you and you're sipping your coffee, this is fine. And really, if you dig into it, the whole thing which justifies my mindset is I'm just like not afraid of the human race destroying ourselves. I'm just not. If that's what we're gonna do, then we're all idiots, and the universe is better off without us. But unfortunately, every peaceful attempt to make progress is usually met with resistance and defeat. And I think the reason for this has a lot to do with the competition that we all have with each other. That every individual person is kind of out for themselves and wants to make the most out of their lives, and usually it ends up with somebody doing something questionable in the pursuit of it. There's like this constant arms race happening in every field you can possibly imagine. And those who are not pushing the limits of what is successful often are not successful. And then kind of like the Gorosei, justifying it in whatever way makes sense to them because it benefits them. So in an act of heroism, because I am right, and I know that I am right, I make a virus that kills off, let's say 90% of the human population. For the greater good, And suddenly a lot of people are questioning whether or not they want evil to occur. The fact is that the United States dropped the bomb and the people here celebrated it. That is simply the facts. But this is where you get into, I guess, tropes, specifically within stories, but I'm sure that they can be expressed in real life as well. Basically like hope, faith, fate. These concepts are very appealing because it allows people to not believe that great evil is necessary. There is a better solution, even if you do not know it. And ultimately, things will end up all right, without you actually having to do anything. But yeah, it's a matter of personal belief, of faith, and of debate, right? And there's a lot of people that don't think in this way, that think that they need more control to be able to produce an outcome that they think is right or just. And without knowing what happens in the future, they could be right. Hypothetically, our collective inaction dooms us all. And great evil was actually required to save everybody. You'll be hard-pressed to find a story which actually argues from this perspective, and typically they occupy the role of villain, in large part because nobody likes to think about this sort of stuff, nor do they like to spread the ideology. But in my opinion, this is how you turn good people into bad guys, and how stories do that. And it's really compelling. And this is what Oda has accomplished with the Gorosei. Specifically, I guess, from like a religious front. They think that Imu is God, that Imu knows best. He is the person that they have faith in, much the same as the Strides have faith in Luffy. And because of this faith, his decisions are the right ones, even if that's not true. This is just one of those masterful inversions and parallels, foils, that Oda throws into the story. You know, like Imu is straight up Luffy. Luffy has, you know, is driven by sort of your small justice, right? Like he protects people that seemingly don't matter because it is the right thing to do, while Imu thinks more on the grand scale of you know, small sacrifices are worthwhile if it means protecting larger numbers of people. Luffy is kind of thoughtless, but has a very empathetic nature, while Imu is the more thoughtful version of potentially the same thing. I would also guess that Luffy and crew subscribe to the notion that fate ultimately will turn out okay. Like the D smile before death, your personal contributions to what's happening doesn't really matter. Ultimately, what is right will eventually occur, whereas Imu probably does not subscribe to this philosophy. They need to make the future that they desire, and if they aren't successful, it spells doom for all. You guys can probably tell I love this, but I almost mentioned this in the last chapter review, but I think now is the time for everybody to reread Nolan and Kagura's flashback, because a lot of the same concepts apply, with the relationship between Kagura, the Shandians, and their god, to the Gorosei and their god, Imu. I think inherently people want some kind of answer, unless their heads are totally buried in the sand. They want some kind of answer to this debate. Should we play an active role in defending and proliferating our beliefs for the betterment of all, or should we put our faith in someone or something else? And I think the most natural counter to this idea that you have to be a part of great evil in order to build the world that you want, the best counterpart is simply having faith in like a god that has a vision for you and for all of us, such that we can live our lives in our own sort of just way, while things play out on the larger scale that are beyond our ability to influence or comprehend. And I find it incredible that One Piece actually tackles this to some degree. The Shandians, they rely upon their god for self-preservation. That's just what they believe. It has always been true. They had an oracle or a priest who directly communicated with God, and this priest told them what they would need to do in order to survive. So in the present story, right, there's this sickness, this disease that's going around killing everyone, and their oracle and their god has a plan that tells them what to do. Sacrifice people to appease this deity. It literally takes the responsibility out of the hands of the people when decisions are made. And in my opinion, based on the context of the story, Oda pretty much told us and convinced the Shandians that you were worshipping a false god. Sacrificing people has nothing to do with your sickness, and Nolan literally proved it. But it illustrates a concept, right? That people, humanity, is very capable of worshipping false gods. And if it's not necessarily a real deity or a god, a false principle, false philosophies, whatever it might be, we are inherently flawed and our judgment is not perfect. As I said last week, I've been watching a lot of Better Call Saul. Better Call Saul is like a lawyer story, right? And he's essentially a con man. He's so good at it. Manipulates people, gets them to believe whatever it is that he wants to. And it just illustrates, right, that, you know, we, as a whole, as an entity, people are very easily manipulated. And this is very clearly what Oda is doing with Imu, right? The Gorosei, as soon as Imu makes a demand or states his intentions, then the Gorosei have complete faith and trust in Imu's judgment. Complete. It doesn't matter what they think. They have some questions and some concerns, but ultimately they defer to him. Or to them. Sorry guys, I've screwed this up so much recently. I don't think it's getting any better. But yeah, Emu is likely a false god. There's great problems and or events loom that threaten the world, and Emu claims to have the solution to these, and the Gorosei believe them, because this is the way of the world for the last 800 years. But Luffy, like Noland, is going to have another solution, and is probably going to be able to prove this solution by actually executing it. Whatever ails the world, the Straw Hats will, either intentionally or by accident, come up with the cure. And human sacrifices was never the answer, nor did it ever do anything substantially good. This actually really excites me, because I'm curious as to what exactly is Oda's philosophy with how to save the world, which seems like something that Oda has to tackle with the story by the way that he's told it. And if you ask me, central to all this also is kind of expressed in Nolan and Kalgra, and this idea is knowledge and progress. Through exploration and research, Nolan had encountered the very same disease which threatened the Shandians. Also, because of this, he knew of the cure. But as he encounters the Shandians and explains, look, I know how to fix this, they don't believe them. So they are acting against knowledge and progress, because it undermines their god, and in large part their way of life. So yeah, I think that this is actually something that One Piece actively teaches. Basically, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit and proliferation of knowledge is definitively right. Withholding and working against this is definitively evil. Any solution or god that requires this suppression as necessary is false, thus making Emu inherently false, regardless of any of these other debates and conversations we've been having. But yeah, just one of those frustrating truths is that if it weren't for the desperation of the Shandian people, essentially their friends, families, daughters, sons, whatever, are all dying, there's no hope in sight, their priest is gone, do they ever listen to Noland? And I think the answer to that is no. Proving someone's god to be false and their entire way of life wrong is very painful, and people will fight against it until they literally can't anymore. Kind of like the same thing here, nobody really questions the erasure of the Void Century and the world government as leaders until the world also reaches this same state of desperation where something else has to occur. Someone has to do something. And that's probably where the Straw Hats step in. But anyway, I've probably talked about this too long. I just wanted to express my thoughts, man, because this is just one of those chapters where it bridges on real life. And that's what I get most out of fiction, really. And any fantasy, One Piece does this from time to time, so, you know, I wanted to talk about it whether you guys liked it or not, so moving on. So one thing I really didn't like about the setup of the destruction of Lulusia is that it didn't appear to be as really thought out as I had hoped. You know, we spent a lot of time just now talking about how Emu is very thoughtful and thinking large scale, but the reason why Emu destroyed Lulusia is its close proximity, which is just a terrible freaking reason to take lives. Like, you know, some things are justified here, with especially the Gorosei's perspective, but from Emu's, it is justified zero, as far as we are aware. And yeah, my knee-jerk to this was I don't like it. I secretly hope that there was more to Emu's decision than meets the eye. Whether it's they simply don't want to tell the Gorosei of their reasons, and the Gorosei essentially express what Emu's thought process, or even maybe if it's not this, then Emu's intuition. Emu has some sort of foresight ability that understands that destroying Lulusia is actually a good idea, but can't actually give a good reason to do so, something to that effect. But, you know, to almost counteract everything that we've been saying in this video up until now, One Piece is a bunch of gray characters and evil is justified, that's incredibly difficult to tell in a story. Most authors do not, because you get into the weeds. And then you start expressing philosophies a lot of people think shouldn't be expressed, which is really interesting considering the discussion we just had about knowledge and progress being essential, right? So discussing these things would seem like the One Piece thing to do, the right thing in One Piece to do. But unfortunately, the real world is complicated, and you just got to be careful. Even what I said in this video, I mean, I just might make enemies, possibly. You know, people are like, oh, like, yeah, JB's evil, right? You know, and then it just is used against me at some point in the future. Likewise, you know, a lot of things that are dictated in stories is not about right and wrong or expressing correct philosophies. It's about selling copies, basically. Having a more clearly defined villain is typically the strategies most stories employ, in large part because that's what people enjoy. Straight up, I think that this kind of conversation stresses a lot of people out. Life is so much easier when you know what to believe, which is also part of the problem, but we won't get into it. So I'm a little bit concerned here that Oda is making Imu a more classic evil villain. Make them more understandable evil, less justified. Honestly, I'll admit, guys, I thought the chapter as a whole was incredibly fire, but this has me bummed out. It just does. All you needed to do was have Imu realize that Sabo was on Lolosia. That's all you needed to do, and then you could potentially justify wiping out an entire country for the sake of preserving his identity, and you go down the rabbit hole, and even if Imu is wrong, it's justified. But with him simply expressing that I'm going to wipe out an entire civilization because of proximity, man, it definitely hurts. And I don't think, based on the themes of One Piece, it's fitting at all. I also think that it borders on the Big Mom effect as well. There's a lot of reasons why people didn't like Big Mom. I did. I thought the discussion surrounding her was fascinating. But a lot of people just wanted Big Mom to be competent. Competent and intimidating. You put these two things together and you have a Yonko that most people would like. But Oda instead turned Big Mom into a gag, into a joke, and a lot of people really hated this. And I'm not saying that they're wrong for doing so, it's a subjective thing. But this decision from Imu is not a competent one, and perhaps indicates a gag future for him. So just be prepared. Like I said, I hope that there's something more to this, but I really wouldn't be surprised if it's as surface level as it seems to be. We talked just in the last video about Imu potentially being childish, and Arter brought up that Imu talks in a simultaneous ancient and childlike way. So we could be seeing the rationale of an idiot. But yeah, I really don't want to dwell on this. We will see what happens in the future, and I'll evaluate it as it comes. And to be quite honest with you guys, again, relating what's happening now with Nolan and Kagura's flashback, the Shandians literally worshipped a snake, literally. A creature of very minimal intelligence nor sense of justice. So yeah. But actually, as one final thought, and I think something like this could go a long way in helping me cope with this reveal, is we theorized before that devil fruit changed people. The devil within the devil fruit, the nature of the devil fruit influences the person, such that we see actively in the story a lot of individuals, devil fruit users, reflect their fruits. So if Imu possesses something evil like your devil, sea of the devil fruit, right? The nature of that fruit might have possessed him in a sense, and then made them, I suppose, more justifiably evil, even if they weren't always that way. Especially if they're immortal and this effect takes place over time. So Imu of 800 years ago was perhaps a different person than Imu today. Honestly, just this detail alone I think would correct for the issues that I personally have with this. Essentially, the world government was founded on good ideology, but as Doflamingo suggests, right, power goes bad. It makes sense for the Gorosei to worship Imu, who today has descended pretty far. But the government is so stuck in their ways that they can't see it. But another way to accomplish the same thing is simply, Imu has lived for 800 years, and over this time period, their value of life has steadily declined. There's no consequences for Imu making mistakes, right? People have come and gone, they don't matter, so we're simply seeing the final version of what immortality and absolute power does to somebody. But like I said, this reminds me a lot of somebody like Big Mom. It reminds me of someone like Gecko Moria. It reminds me of a top tier villain that Oda inevitably dunks on, because it's frankly idiotic. With the process of destroying Lolosia, my impression is that Imu has gotten fat and happy. There's no thought behind the decision, which reflects on him as a villain. Anyway, moving on, we got the names of the Gorosei in this chapter. I'm not going to go over this. I assume every other reviewer explained in great detail how each of the names is either a direct mention of a planet in our solar system or some sort of wordplay to reach that same pronunciation or conclusion. I think it's cool, and I'm loving the idea of, Oda eventually tackling the question of, are the celestial dragons related to space in some way, or the moons, or what is actually going on there, the history of the world, how the One Piece world came to be as it is. That's really exciting. But what we still don't understand, and this was brought up once again in the chapter, is why Imu has an interest in Vivi. This is a lingering mystery. The more that Oda brings it up, the more that you know that it is important. And we're really no closer to an answer. Even the conversation that Imu had with Cobra, I don't think sheds too much light on why Vivi herself is important. The going theory for some time has obviously been that Vivi might be an ancient weapon. I've already expressed I'm not a huge fan of that idea. If it happens, right? It's just not something that I'm personally invested in. But I do want to say this, right? And this is why Vivi is interesting as a character to me. Likely Vivi will play the same role as her ancestor. Lily created the government of the New Era, was at least a part of that, and I would probably argue a substantial part of that. And when the Straw Hats defeat the world government in Blackbeard and the world is engulfed in flame and is reborn, Vivi is going to be spearheading the New Era, more so even than Luffy in my opinion. So she's actually one of the few characters that you can reasonably argue is as important as Luffy. Anyway, continuing the story, we then pan around to the government, which is struggling, and we see the other models of the Seraphim. We see Doflamingo, Moria, and Crocodile. I just want to highlight Crocodile here for a moment. Crocodile's expression and overall demeanor is fascinating. It doesn't really seem Crocodile-like. And I'm gonna say this, okay, don't get mad, alright, but there's been a theory for a very long time that Crocodile was originally a woman. And this has something to do with what Ivankov mentioned in Impel Down about knowing a secret about Crocodile that Crocodile did not want revealed. And this was a big theory. I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but you could perhaps speculate that Ivankov used her abilities on Crocodile to change Crocodile into a man, biologically speaking. And so we see Crocodile as a child, and in my opinion, it's very gender ambiguous. So I kind of hope that Oda goes all the way and actually confirms this theory. Not that it's like a big deal, really. It's just a want of mine. That would be really cool and has definitely been foreshadowed. And just come on, like I just want it, okay? But do you guys see what I see? Like Crocodile being kind of ambiguous? Talk about a single detail which would totally change people's perception of the character at immense layers of depth. Easily. And Oda certainly hasn't shied away from things like this, even recently in Wano with a character like Kiku. Sabo then goes on to explain what happened after he docked on Lulusia. First off, the royalty there were captured by the people. His actions, the news of him killing a king of the world's government, Cobra, made him a hero. And he talks about how he wanted to tell the people the truth, but seeing how his actions or the rumors had sparked the flames of rebellion, the words died in his mouth. This is something that I just hate about life. Lies can be used to manipulate people. Like the reality is that most people are ignorant. It is impossible for the people in Lulusia to know what actually occurred in the reverie. It is literally impossible for them to have perspective on Cobra as a leader, as a ruler, and it's just not in Sabo's interest to inform them because of his own agenda, and it's frustrating. But this goes directly back into what we were discussing earlier and why Nolan and Kagura is a must-read right now. Knowledge in progress is always right. Entities which have to repress knowledge in order to win are wrong. So this is like saying that what Sabo just did here makes the Revolutionary Army a false god. Or at least plants the seeds that if the Revolutionary Army were to win, take down the world government and replace them, they will likely fall into the very same trap that the world government has. The people are only entitled to partial truths which benefit us, because we know that we're right. And frankly, the idea that people cannot be entrusted with knowledge. Which also is a very interesting discussion that we could have, but I will spare you. But yeah, Sabo describes the weapon's appearance and intimates it to the Revolutionary Army. We get a reveal of Imu's original name from the Void Century, most likely their original name from the Void Century, which was Saint Imu of the Nerona family, which I wonder if it's related to in any way the Roman Emperor Nero. This could honestly be a short video by itself. I don't know if I want to get into all the details of it, but if you're unaware of who Nero was or what he did or his role in history or his general perception and legacy afterwards, all of it seems very fitting here with Imu as he is described in this chapter, and likely the role that Imu will play when the government falls. And generally, Nero is like your quintessential example of power corrupting. Empires rise and fall. And if we take this connection and start really applying it to the One Piece story and Imu as a character, I think that you would probably describe Imu, if he's Nero-like, as basically a spoiled brat that is considered one of the cruelest people ever. I've already plugged Better Call Saul. Guys, absolutely watch that if you want something amazing to watch. Another plug that we can throw in here is The Boys, and the character that I would use here as a reference would be Homelander. If you know, you know. But anyway, the Revolutionary Army had a really interesting question near the end of this chapter. Sabo describes the weapon that Imu used. Dragon says, Robin told us that the ancient weapons do in fact exist, but if this person had such a weapon, why wait till now to use it? Which in one part reaffirms that Vegapunk hasn't told them anything, that this is a relatively new invention. But it also describes the Revolutionary Army in a way that we've actually discussed before. Like, this is a serious question. Would the Revolutionary Army use the ancient weapons to defeat the world government if they possess them? And is this something that at some point Dragon could desire to have? It's interesting because we know that Shirahoshi Poseidon is an ancient weapon. And we know Luffy as a character, likely as the hero of the story, he would never ever ever use Poseidon as a weapon like that. Which is precisely what Queen Otohime tells us was kind of like the point of the power, that somebody would come along to guide her to use her powers correctly. There's like a correct way to do it. And in my opinion, it does not involve taking mass lives, even if potentially that could happen. This is not only true for Poseidon. In my opinion, the Ancient Kingdom created all the ancient weapons without the intention to actually use them. And I also think that their philosophy to not use the weapons is in large part the reason why they lost. They wouldn't drop the bomb even if it meant losing. So at least from a story perspective, this is the correct take to have. So anybody who does not share this or does not understand this is wrong, which might very well include the Revolutionary Army. And like I said, we speculated this before, it'd be really awesome, in my opinion, for Dragon to at some point in time be tempted by the power of the ancient weapons and for them to become a pseudo-enemy, a villain of sorts against the Strat's agenda. Some conflict there, ideologically. And the main purpose for this is that right now it's unclear why the Revolutionary Army is not the heroes of the story, especially if the world government is your endgame villain. It's not Blackbeard, it's totally Imu and the Gorosei. Then aren't the Revolutionary Armies fighting for exactly what the Strats are going to be eventually fighting for? Their agendas are going to be 100% aligned, so should we have been rooting for the Revolutionary Army all along? And I think just thematically it's not fitting. Like, Luffy is the hero of the story, and his path is going to end up being different in some ways to Dragon and the Revolutionary Army, and this is the way that is most intuitive to me. Luffy will find the better solution. And that finally takes us to the last panel of the chapter, and probably the most hype panel of the chapter. We get introduced to the Supreme Commander of the Gods' Knights, Saint Figurland Garling. This former king of the land known as God Valley has sentenced Saint Mosgard to execution. Like, straight up, I think most people know this by now, but this is like very likely to be Shank's dad. And Shank's dad is 100% a racist. Honestly, this is so freaking cool. From his design, it's epic. It's almost like punk-esque, which is really interesting for a father figure. But with this hair shaped like the crescent moon, I mean, this just continues along with what we were talking about earlier with all of the Gorosei having names related to planets, celestial. Even back when some of the one-shots, Romance Dawn that Oda wrote, the first true villain of One Piece was, I think his name was like Crescent Moon. and had a similar design. I wish I had more interesting things to really talk about him. I feel like everything is pretty much surface level. What we're seeing here is we're seeing the world government's main force. When comes the final battle, if they're there, right, these are the characters that are going to matter. And just an interaction between Shanks and likely at least his relative, probably his father, you know you can expect great things there. I still don't want to say too much about Shanks because I have planned like a character analysis video for him. And this kind of character being his father was something that was already sort of built into that idea, and I do want to just make it its own thing. But I think that Shanks being a Figureland is incredibly important in defining everything that he's done since Gold Roger died. And it just reaffirms, man, that Oda must have had real shit parents because he does not like familial bonds at all. Like, seriously. Very rarely is there a wholesome relationship between biological parents and children. But I suppose the main conversation that surrounds him is how strong is he? And obviously the presence is there. And I have no doubt that Garling is a top tier fighter, but is he Yonko level? Well, things could have changed in 40 years, but as the prior king of God Valley, which is a question in and of itself, why is God Valley even a thing? What made Celestial Dragons move from Revujo to God Valley and form like a separate entity? And why was it that it became a target? And like all of this stuff is fascinating to me. It's almost like, I almost want to speculate, that the world government actually divided sometime in the past, where you had two separate groups of Celestial Dragons that were actually in conflict. But that's beside the point. In God Valley, right, nobody talks about St. Garling Figureland. Rocks destroyed God Valley, and Roger and Garp defeated Rocks. So it's Garling is put on a lower pedestal here. I'm not saying that it was a low diff fight, but ultimately Rocks won. Probably handily enough to be able to fight Roger and Garp shortly afterwards. There's actually an interesting line between Shanks and Whitebeard, where Whitebeard tells Shanks that looking at him makes his scars ache, and it could be related to Shanks' father. So essentially the person who defeated St. Garling in God Valley was a member of the Rocks Pirates, Whitebeard, likely a commander, but not Rocks himself. So Pirates still get a major dub, and still reign supreme as the greatest force on the planet. But yeah, for right now, because of God Valley, I don't think that Garling is a Yonko level fighter, bearing in mind things could change. But if there's like a legit matchup between Shanks and Garling, then obviously that they would have to be. But you could see Oda tell this story in all sorts of different ways, so I'm not sure that we can actually be certain of anything. Like, we could have a whole Sanji and Vinsmoke type interaction between Shanks and Garling, where Shanks has surpassed him by a mile, and just hasn't demonstrated that to him yet. But we'll see. I think a lot of people's opinions will be dictated by what they want, and just frankly, because this character looks so awesome and has such a great presence, I think that even I really do hope that they're as powerful as they look. But I can already tell you by the way that Garling has expressed himself, his defeat is going to be enjoyable. It's going to be an epic moment, and I am so ready for it. But yeah, guys, really long review, hopefully not too long-winded and too tangential, but as always, curious as to what you guys think. If you know something from the chapter that I might have missed, just share your thoughts. Remember to check out my book, The Booms, Volume 1 and 2 is out. Links in the description as well as pinned in the comments. And if you guys happen to read it, please leave a review to let other people know what you think about it. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.